You can lose weight, watch the number on the scale drop, feel your clothes getting looser, and still be heading straight towards serious disease. That's the truth most people never hear. As a cardiologist, I can tell you with confidence that the fat you see in the mirror is often not the fat that concerns me the most. The real danger is hidden. It does not sit under the skin where you can pinch it. It wraps itself tightly around your organs, around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, even around your heart. That hidden fat is called visceral fat, and you can look perfectly normal on the outside while carrying a dangerous amount of it inside. I've seen this repeatedly in my practice. Patients walk into my office shocked. They don't appear overweight, yet their scans reveal fatty liver, inflamed tissue, hardened arteries. They assumed they were healthy because their reflection looked acceptable. But visceral fat does not care about appearances. It operates quietly, influencing your biology in ways most people never imagine. And here is the critical point. Visceral fat is not just stored energy. It is not an inactive reserve waiting patiently to be used. It behaves like an organ. In fact, it functions as an endocrine organ, releasing chemical messages that influence inflammation, insulin resistance, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, and even cancer risk. When visceral fat becomes dominant, it is like having a rogue authority inside your body, constantly sending harmful instructions. Chronic inflammation rises, hormones become distorted, metabolism shifts into dysfunction. This is why losing visceral fat is not about aesthetics. It is not about fitting into smaller clothing. It is about rebuilding your internal environment. When visceral fat begins to break down, the transformation is not just visible. It is cellular, hormonal, and metabolic. The body starts to operate differently from the inside out. Before I continue, if you are new to this channel, I encourage you to subscribe. Your support allows me to continue sharing this information in detail. Now, for decades, we were told that fat loss is simple. Eat less, move more. But that oversimplified model ignores the biology of fat, especially visceral fat. This type of fat actively releases inflammatory molecules such as interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. It promotes insulin resistance. It interferes with leptin, the hormone that tells your brain you are full. It raises cortisol, keeping your body in a chronic stress response. This is why visceral fat is strongly associated with heart disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, cognitive decline, autoimmune conditions, and even cancer. Chronic inflammation is the foundation upon which many modern diseases develop. And visceral fat is one of its strongest drivers. Now, here is the encouraging part. When visceral fat begins to break down, everything starts to shift. But it does not happen randomly, and it does not happen overnight. There is a biological order to this process. The body will not release visceral fat unless the hormonal conditions are correct. Insulin must fall. Energy availability must drop enough that the body is forced to access its stored reserves. This is where fasting patterns, metabolic timing, sleep quality, and stress regulation become essential. Visceral fat is extremely sensitive to hormonal signals. When insulin remains elevated, this fat is protected. Insulin is a storage hormone. Its role is to preserve energy, not release it. As long as insulin is high, fat remains locked away, especially the fat surrounding your organs. That is why so many people diet and exercise, yet struggle to reduce abdominal fat. They are working hard, but insulin is still in control. When insulin finally drops, the message changes. The body shifts from storage mode into access mode. Visceral fat becomes metabolically active. Think of it as a secure vault that only opens when the correct hormonal password is entered. Once that vault opens, fatty acids begin entering the bloodstream. These fats are not randomly distributed. They are directed toward organs that need metabolic relief, starting with the liver. The liver is your metabolic headquarters. When it is surrounded by visceral fat, it becomes inflamed, resistant to insulin, and overloaded with fat. This condition is known as fatty liver disease, and it is one of the most underestimated contributors to metabolic illness. When visceral fat starts to break down, the liver finally has an opportunity to recover. Mobilized fatty acids are converted into ketones, an efficient and clean fuel source. Ketones reduce oxidative stress, they calm inflammation, they provide steady energy to the brain and heart. At the same time, inflammatory markers begin to decline. Interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha decrease. In my clinical experience, I often see laboratory improvements before any visible weight change occurs. Blood work improves before the mirror reflects the transformation. As inflammation settles, insulin sensitivity improves. Muscles begin responding properly to insulin again. The pancreas experiences relief. Blood sugar stabilizes. Leptin signaling strengthens, allowing the brain to recognize fullness. Cravings begin to fade. Cortisol levels gradually normalize, reducing the stress-driven environment that favors visceral fat storage. Patients often tell me they feel calmer, their thinking becomes clearer, their energy stabilizes, sleep deepens. These changes are not coincidental. They are biological signals that internal repair is underway. If you are still following this discussion, comment below the word "Yes, doctor," so I know you are engaged. And if you find this information helpful, consider liking and subscribing. Now, what happens next goes far beyond the liver, because once visceral fat starts to shrink, the benefits do not stay limited to the liver. They begin to spread outward, influencing other systems in ways that many people never connect to belly fat. One of the first areas to experience this shift is the gut. The relationship between visceral fat and gut health is deeper than most realize. When visceral fat is excessive, it drives inflammation directly into the intestinal lining. That inflammation weakens the barrier of the gut, allowing substances that should remain inside the intestines to leak into the bloodstream. Among these substances are bacterial fragments known as lipopolysaccharides. When they enter circulation, the immune system reacts as if there is a threat. This process, often called metabolic endotoxemia, fuels insulin resistance, chronic immune activation, and systemic inflammation. It is quiet, persistent, and extremely disruptive. Many chronic diseases are accelerated by this low-grade inflammatory state. As visceral fat begins to break down, this inflammatory pressure starts to ease. The intestinal lining has a chance to repair itself. The tight junctions between gut cells strengthen. Fewer toxins escape into the bloodstream. The immune system, which has a large presence in the gut, becomes more balanced and less reactive. This single shift has powerful downstream effects. Inflammatory markers continue to decline. Autoimmune symptoms often become less intense. Joint discomfort improves. Even skin conditions begin to calm. These improvements may appear unrelated, but they share a common root. By reducing visceral fat, you are reducing one of the body's primary sources of inflammatory signaling. You're not treating isolated symptoms. You are quieting the source. At the same time, the gut microbiome begins to transform. A healthier metabolic environment encourages the growth of beneficial bacteria. These bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, which nourish the intestinal lining and reduce inflammation further. Butyrate also enhances insulin sensitivity and supports metabolic flexibility. The gut gradually shifts from a state of conflict to one of stability. Now let's turn to the brain, because this is where many people notice unexpected changes. Visceral fat communicates with the brain through hormones inflammatory molecules, and neural pathways such as the vagus nerve. When visceral fat levels are high, the brain receives constant stress signals. This can manifest as mental fog, low mood, irritability, or anxiety. Chronic inflammation affects neurotransmitter balance and impairs energy production in brain cells. When visceral fat begins to melt away, those stress signals diminish. Ketones, which increase during fat breakdown, provide a steady alternative fuel for the brain. Unlike glucose spikes and crashes, ketones deliver consistent energy. At the same time, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, begins to rise. BDNF supports neuron growth, resilience, and plasticity. Many patients describe sharper focus and improved clarity. They report feeling calmer and more emotionally stable. These changes are not imagined, they are biological. The brain responds quickly when inflammation decreases and energy supply stabilizes. It begins to function as it was designed to function. The immune system also recalibrates during this process. Visceral fat continuously stimulates immune cells, keeping them in a low-level activated state. Over time, this chronic stimulation leads to immune exhaustion and inappropriate inflammatory responses. As visceral fat declines, immune cells shift away from constant activation and toward repair and regulation. Inflammation becomes purposeful rather than persistent. Another important system that improves is the mitochondria, the tiny energy-producing structures inside every cell. Chronic inflammation damages mitochondria and reduces the body's ability to switch between fuel sources. When inflammation falls and ketones rise, mitochondrial efficiency improves. The body regains metabolic flexibility, meaning it can smoothly transition between burning glucose and burning fat. This flexibility is a hallmark of metabolic health. This is why I often describe visceral fat loss as a metabolic revolution. It is not simply shrinking fat cells. It is restoring communication between organs, hormones, and cellular systems. The liver, gut, brain, immune system, and mitochondria begin working in coordination again. What is remarkable is that many of these changes occur before significant weight loss is visible. The scale may move slowly, yet internally, profound healing is already taking place. This is why focusing only on body weight can be misleading. The deeper victory happens within your blood markers, your inflammatory profile, and your hormonal balance. If you are finding this valuable, comment below the words metabolic revolution so I know this message is resonating. And if you believe this information could help someone else, share it with them. Now I want to shift the discussion towards something equally important: rhythm. Visceral fat does not respond well to force, but it responds extremely well to consistency and timing. You cannot push it away through extreme calorie restriction or endless hours of cardio. Visceral fat is hormonally guarded. It only releases when the body senses stability and safety. Think of your body as a city governed by hormones. When those hormonal signals are chaotic, the system becomes disorganized. Irregular eating patterns, late-night meals, insufficient sleep, and chronic stress all send the same message. Resources are uncertain. Danger is present. Conserve energy. Under those conditions, visceral fat remains protected. The moment you restore rhythm, everything begins to change. When you establish consistent fasting windows, insulin begins to drop predictably. At first, the change is subtle, but it is steady. Over time, the body learns that glucose does not need to be constantly available. Fat stores begin to open. And because visceral fat is metabolically active, it is often the first reserve the body begins to access once insulin resistance improves. Sleep plays an equally powerful role. Poor sleep elevates cortisol, and elevated cortisol tells visceral fat to remain in place. When sleep aligns with natural circadian rhythms, cortisol normalizes and melatonin rises appropriately. Growth hormone pulses during deep sleep, and growth hormone is one of the most effective signals for mobilizing visceral fat. Many individuals notice abdominal fat decreasing simply by improving sleep quality. The body finally transitions from survival mode into repair mode during the night. Stress management is another pillar. Psychological stress increases gut permeability, raises inflammatory cytokines, and encourages visceral fat accumulation. The vagus nerve acts as a communication channel between the brain and the gut. When stress dominates, danger signals travel continuously along this pathway. When stress decreases through breathing practices, time outdoors, social connection, or regular walking, the nervous system shifts into a parasympathetic state. That shift signals safety, and visceral fat responds accordingly. Food quality also matters, but not solely because of calories. Visceral fat responds to signals. Ultra-processed foods increase inflammation, disrupt gut bacteria, and spike insulin. Whole foods reduce inflammatory load and support microbial balance. Fiber strengthens gut integrity and lowers endotoxin leakage. This reduces the inflammatory pressure that drives visceral fat storage. As these rhythms stabilize, leptin sensitivity improves. Hunger becomes regulated instead of constant. Ghrelin patterns normalize. You stop thinking about food throughout the day. At the same time, adiponectin rises, enhancing insulin sensitivity and fat oxidation. And what makes this process powerful is that it does not feel like punishment. When biology aligns with your lifestyle, effort decreases while results improve. You are no longer fighting your body. You are working with it. Now, many people still believe that losing visceral fat is simply about eating less and moving more. Let me explain why that oversimplification continues to fail so many individuals. Because this is where confusion has cost people years of frustration. Many still believe that visceral fat disappears the same way the fat under the skin does. They assume that if the scale drops, the problem is solved. But visceral fat does not follow that simple rule. You can reduce overall weight, even lose muscle in the process, and still hold on to metabolically dangerous fat around your organs. That is why so many individuals diet aggressively, push themselves through exhausting workouts, and yet their abdomen remains firm, their lab results remain abnormal, and their metabolic risk stays high. This happens because visceral fat does not respond to calorie restriction alone. It responds to hormonal permission. When you drastically cut calories without correcting insulin resistance, the body interprets that as a threat. Metabolism slows down to conserve energy. Cortisol rises to help you cope with the perceived stress. Muscle tissue is broken down to supply fuel. Meanwhile, visceral fat, which the body views as a strategic reserve protecting vital organs, becomes even more guarded. This is why extreme dieting often backfires. The body shifts into survival mode. And in survival mode, it does not willingly release the fat that surrounds critical organs. Instead, it preserves it. What truly initiates visceral fat reduction is restoring insulin sensitivity. Insulin is the gatekeeper. As long as insulin remains elevated throughout the day, fat remains locked away. Frequent snacking, constant grazing, sugary beverages, and refined carbohydrates keep insulin chronically high. Even if calories are modest, repeated insulin spikes prevent access to stored fat. When insulin falls and remains low long enough, the locks begin to open. This is where fasting becomes a powerful tool, not because it starves the body, but because it removes continuous insulin stimulation. During extended overnight fasting windows, insulin finally returns to baseline. The body shifts from storage mode to fuel access mode. Visceral fat, being metabolically active, becomes available for breakdown. As this process continues, the liver undergoes meaningful change. In fatty liver disease, the liver becomes overloaded with triglycerides, and resistant to insulin signals. When fat begins to be exported instead of stored, hepatic insulin sensitivity improves. The liver regulates glucose production more effectively. Fasting blood sugar stabilizes. Triglyceride levels decline. Small, dense LDL particles, which are strongly associated with cardiovascular risk, decrease, not because cholesterol was directly targeted, but because inflammation and insulin resistance were addressed at their root. This is a critical concept. Cardiovascular risk improves long before dramatic weight loss is visible. Blood pressure begins to normalize. Endothelial function, which reflects the health of blood vessels, improves. C-reactive protein declines. These measurable changes reflect internal healing, even if the mirror has not yet caught up. The gut continues to play a central role in this transformation. Visceral fat is closely connected to gut inflammation and microbial imbalance. When the intestinal barrier is compromised, bacterial toxins enter circulation and stimulate immune activation. This process encourages further visceral fat storage as a protective buffer. It becomes a cycle. When fasting patterns are consistent and whole foods replace processed ones, the gut lining repairs itself. Endotoxin load decreases. Immune activation settles. The body no longer feels compelled to expand visceral fat as a defensive mechanism. This is how the cycle begins to reverse. Mitochondria also benefit. These cellular energy centers are damaged by chronic inflammation and excessive glucose exposure. As insulin levels stabilize and ketone production increases, mitochondria regain efficiency. The body recovers metabolic flexibility, meaning it can switch between burning glucose and burning fat without stress. Without metabolic flexibility, visceral fat accumulates easily. With flexibility restored, visceral fat becomes unnecessary. Many individuals describe this stage as a turning point. Energy remains steady throughout the day. Afternoon crashes diminish. Brain fog lifts. Exercise feels less exhausting. Recovery improves. These experiences are not motivational illusions. They are biochemical consequences of reduced inflammation and improved fuel utilization. However, this process cannot be rushed. Visceral fat develops over years of metabolic strain. It does not disappear in a week. Consistency matters more than intensity. Eating patterns that respect circadian biology allow insulin to fall predictably. Movement enhances insulin sensitivity rather than depleting the nervous system. Sleep restores hormonal balance. Stress reduction calms immune activation. If you are still listening, comment below the words "I'm listening" so I know you are committed to understanding this fully. And if you're gaining value, share this lecture with someone who may benefit. Now, I want to address something deeper, because this is where the conversation shifts from blame to clarity. Visceral fat is not your enemy. It is a response. It is the body adapting to signals that suggest the environment is stressful, inflammatory, and unpredictable. When I see a patient with significant visceral fat, I do not see laziness. I see a nervous system that has been under chronic strain. I see a liver overwhelmed by constant insulin exposure. I see a gut leaking inflammatory molecules. I see hormones locked in survival mode. Visceral fat develops to protect vital organs from ongoing metabolic chaos. The body prioritizes survival over appearance every time, always. So, when visceral fat begins to break down, you are not simply witnessing fat loss, you are witnessing a biological agreement. The body is signaling that it no longer needs that emergency reserve. Insulin resistance improves not because calories were drastically cut, but because insulin finally has time to fall. Cortisol declines because sleep improves and stress signals decrease. Adiponectin rises, enhancing fat metabolism and insulin sensitivity. Leptin begins functioning properly again, allowing the brain to sense fullness and adequate energy availability. At the same time, inflammatory markers drop, tumor necrosis factor alpha declines, interleukin 6 decreases, C reactive protein improves. These are not abstract laboratory numbers. They are measurable indicators that internal inflammation is resolving. As inflammation declines, the brain benefits further. Neuroinflammation reduces, blood flow improves. Many individuals notice reduced anxiety, improved mood, and sharper thinking. This makes biological sense. Visceral, fat-driven inflammation does not stay confined to the abdomen. It influences the brain, heart, joints, and immune system. The gut microbiome continues to shift in a favorable direction. Beneficial bacteria thrive when insulin spikes decrease and fiber intake increases. Short-chain fatty acids rise. The intestinal barrier strengthens. Endotoxin leakage diminishes. Once again, visceral fat is no longer required as a protective buffer. People often describe this as a moment when something finally clicked. Their habits may not appear extreme, but their biology shifted in a profound way. And this brings us to an essential truth. You cannot force this process through punishment. Overtraining, severe restriction, sleep deprivation, and chronic stress all delay visceral fat loss. They reinforce the signal of danger. What accelerates visceral fat reduction is stability, consistency, and safety. Now let me explain exactly why excessive restriction and relentless cardio often keep visceral fat in place instead of eliminating it. Because understanding this is crucial. Many people assume that burning visceral fat is about pushing harder, exercising longer, or eating less. They chase extreme routines, believing discipline equals results. But visceral fat does not respond to coercion. It responds to environmental signals inside the body. When the body perceives danger through chronic stress, poor sleep, constant calorie restriction, or metabolic chaos, it holds onto visceral fat as a protective measure. Aggressive dieting or endless workouts send signals of scarcity. The body interprets this as a threat, and insulin remains elevated. Fat stores around vital organs are locked in place, and weight loss becomes superficial, focusing on subcutaneous fat, while the real danger, visceral fat, remains untouched. This is why restoring hormonal balance is the key. When the internal environment signals safety and abundance, visceral fat begins to release itself. Insulin falls, cortisol stabilizes, growth hormone pulses during deep sleep, adiponectin rises, leptin sensitivity improves, inflammation decreases. These hormonal shifts are the true drivers of visceral fat loss, not extreme caloric restriction or exhaustive cardio. The body is always choosing survival over aesthetics. Once it senses stability, it willingly dismantles its emergency fat reserves. Fasting plays a central role in this process, but not for the reasons many assume. It is not about starving the body. It is about giving insulin time to fall. Constant snacking keeps insulin elevated, which maintains the lock on visceral fat. By extending periods without caloric intake, especially overnight, the body enters a state where fat can be accessed safely. Free fatty acids are mobilized, ketone production rises, and the liver begins exporting stored fat. Fatty liver reverses. Hepatic insulin sensitivity improves, blood sugar stabilizes, triglycerides decline, inflammatory markers drop. These are measurable signs that the body is repairing itself internally long before dramatic changes appear on the scale. Sleep and circadian rhythm are equally powerful. Poor sleep elevates cortisol, telling visceral fat to stay firmly in place. Proper sleep alignment with deep restorative stages allows cortisol to normalize, melatonin to rise appropriately, and growth hormone to pulse. Growth hormone is a potent signal for mobilizing visceral fat, facilitating repair, and promoting tissue restoration overnight. People who improve sleep often notice belly fat decreasing even without changing their diet drastically. The body finally moves from survival mode into repair mode during the night.